Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is the results of an immunotherapy trial to help those with lupus. The unnecessary but somehow necessary advice not to steam your vagina with magic mushrooms. A result showing that it's not just who can abuse power, and a case study of a woman who consumed 55 AA and AAA batteries. These and other news items can be found at the timestamps given below. Let's start with the lupus clinical trial. It is an admittedly small trial. It only involves 5 patients, but they all are seriously ill. All of them are now in remission after being given a single dose of modified immune cells. Lupus is an autoimmune disease. That is, a disease where your body learns to attack itself, and as a result goes about damaging all of the parts of your body. This leads to gradual but certain organ damage. It can also start attacking joints, neurological function, and all sorts of other mechanisms in your body that you really want to have. It does more affect women than men, but it's not entirely only one sex. Its causes are myriad, but it's generally considered to be a mixture of genetics and environment. Then again, what isn't? Most of the time, it's controlled by the use of anti-inflammatories and steroids to suppress the immune system. This works for the most part, but it does lead to other complications, and to a certain extent, their effectiveness wanes over time. This means that gradually people need more of the medication and it has more consequences for them. This is where modifying immune cells comes into play and how it seems to have solved the issue, at least in this small particular clinical trial. The mechanism probably shouldn't surprise you that much. It involves genetic modification of the host's own immune cells and then putting them back into their body. The genetic modifications here were intended to do one thing: facilitate these modified immune cells to hunt down and destroy B cells that were causing this particular problem. The study involved 4 women and a man, so it's slightly unusual for clinical trials which generally only use males to make it simple. But all of those involved have at least been in remission for between 5 and 17 months. That is, 5 to 17 months without any new B cells being made that are attacking their own body. There are other ways to do it, but the other methods that are available tend to completely destroy the immune system. This is a much more targeted and effective solution that leaves the immune system intact for the most part and cures the person of their lupus. Evidence-based clinical studies like that are why we have medicine that works. It's why we then are left wondering just how it is people think it's a great idea to do something like smoke mushrooms and puff that smoke into their vagina. It seems that despite getting a vast number of questions about various different possible things that can be put in their vagina, even Dr. Jen Gunter, who has a history of debunking these things, is surprised when something like this comes up. We're not saying that magic mushrooms is not being investigated for treatment of some conditions, and yes, there is some clinical evidence to show that it may be useful for things like depression and PTSD. It sure as hell isn't there for something like this. Vaginal smoking or vaginal steaming, regardless of what you want to call it, does not really have any notable benefits under any circumstances. Historically, it was thought that perhaps the vapors of whatever it is you were smoking or steaming would find their way into the vagina and help it heal. This was effectively a pointless exercise, as very little would get in to start with, and what did get in tended to have little to no effect whatsoever. We now know that many of the things that they were trying to remove historically either were imaginary or could be dealt with things like antibiotics or good personal hygiene. Mushrooms, on the other hand, that's a different game. The way these work is that the mushrooms have a compound in them called psilocybin. Psilocybin is a prodrug, that is something that gets converted in your body into the actual drug. The drug itself is called psylocin. Its activity is primarily in the brain. The advantages of consuming it as a foodstuff are that the main mechanisms to convert it from the prodrug to the actual drug are in the gut and liver. Because of this, if you eat magic mushrooms or smoke them to a certain extent, you can get the active chemical out of it. This won't happen if you try and smoke it into your vagina. The reason for that is very simple. There is nothing there that the active version, psilocin, will work on. Further to that, it's entirely possible that, given the nature of what these chemicals are, heat and steam will inactivate it by fundamentally destroying its functional areas. This, of course, is all based on the idea that it's going to somehow work. That ignores one big caveat to mushrooms. Mushrooms are a kind of fungi, and fungi are not something you want to get established in your vagina as an infection. And yes, you can get yeast or other fungal infection from doing this. Where the heat and steam can cause inactivation of the psilocin, the same can't be said of possible fungal infections arising from this. The reality is that they're quite resilient as a life form, and unfortunately that means that the steam or smoke could well and truly carry them up and into the vagina, where they will start a new colony. For this reason, no, at no point should you put the smoke or steam from magic mushrooms anywhere near you, especially in this way. It's not that everybody is stupid, it just seems to be that with the internet the way it is, the examples of human stupidity just become more and more well known and are easily communicated. A case study coming out of Ireland this week shows exactly that. Doctors had to remove 50 batteries from a woman's GI tract after she swallowed them, trying to commit self-harm. The 66-year-old woman was taken to St. Vincent's University Hospital in Dublin after consuming a number of cylindrical batteries, these being your standard AA and AAA batteries. X-rays showed that there were indeed a great many tucked away in her, and fortunately for her, at least as far as the health outcomes are concerned, none of them had any structural damage. This means whatever was used to run in them, it used to be things like lead acid, although it can now be things like lithium, didn't break free and cause her harm. In an effort to avoid having to do surgery, as this would be rather invasive and unpleasant, they waited about a week. In that week, she passed 5 of the batteries that were within her, the larger AA batteries. Unfortunately, the remainder did not come through her, despite them waiting 3 more weeks. This was now starting to cause her considerable abdominal pain, and we're hoping, reflecting on her actions, she decided it was well and truly a bad decision. In order to remove the remaining 45 or so batteries, they had to conduct what is called a laparotomy. That is basically a small incision, then going into the abdominal cavity, finding the stomach, and then trying to remove them that way. The reason they had to go to the stomach is because that's where they were located and they were causing it to become stretched and distended. This is why she was in pain. In the end, they found a total of 55 batteries in her GI tract. There were the 46 removed from the stomach, a further 4 that were found in the part of her duodenum where they couldn't quite get to and therefore had to move it further into the colon itself to find its way eventually to the anus, plus the 5 that were passed earlier on. Another X-ray confirmed that they were all removed and she recovered, as the doctors reported. To the best of our knowledge, this case represents the highest reported number of batteries ingested at a single point in time. Not exactly a record you would want to hold. Going from case studies to more clinical studies, and this time it's more a critique than an actual study itself worthy of attention. Unfortunately, it's a multivitamin use study, and much like the serotonin antidepressant article, It's getting a lot of attention, but for all the wrong reasons. People are looking at this and fundamentally assessing it to mean that multivitamins will help you as you get older and retain cognitive function. The problem with this entire study can be put down to one thing. They never established a baseline. Yeah, they gave these people a treatment, but didn't know what the treatment was adding to what they were already receiving or having in their diet or what was in their body. That's an issue. Any time you want to add something, particularly when we're looking at things like supplements and vitamins, you need to know how much you're adding to what is already there so you can measure not only is there a response, but is there a dose-dependent response. That's where this particular article is an issue. They've made all kinds of claims, things like attention, recall, long-term memory, verbal performance, and a bunch of other clinical manifestations, and they're claiming that the multivitamins helped with these. How can they say that when they don't have that baseline? How do they know that they actually made any difference and they didn't just give these people a large amount of vitamins to increase the cost of their urine? Because that's all that's going to happen to a lot of these vitamins if they were already receiving adequate dietary intake. This is just like vitamin C. Adding more does not make a difference if you already have adequate dietary intake. In defense of this study, we can recognize that it was a very large study for what it is, more than 2,200 subjects in total, and it was run over 3 years. That doesn't, however, resolve the issues that we've already identified. All of the improvements that they observed over those 3 years aren't necessarily able to be attributed to the cause that they've put them down to. The article that we initially became aware of this from is on sciencebasedmedicine.org, and we'll provide a link to that in the description below, where they go into other issues to do with this study that aren't as fundamental to its premise as what we've described. Rather, they go into its role in things like cardiovascular disease, and there are various vitamins and minerals that can be useful in reducing the adverse risks associated with that. The next article is all about the research that claims that men in middle management are more likely to be engaging in questionable social behavior in the workplace. The argument that they propose is that much of the research that exists has focused on men in power rather than those working their way up the food chain. There is the argument that men in high positions tend to abuse that power in various ways. Their experiment instead looked at 203 volunteers, both males and females, to figure out what they would do if they were either the boss or the employee. They concluded in their research that those who were male students and told they were working for a female boss would generally have selected more questions and actions that were flirtatious and trying to use their sexuality to get an advance in life than their female counterparts, or their male counterparts who were a boss, or the female counterparts who were a boss. This goes against some of the established stereotypes. That is, either females will use their womanly wiles, for lack of a better word, but it seems to be that it might be better to say male wiles in this case, whereas those who were put in the position of power did not exercise anywhere near as much sexual social behavior as it's described. Their conclusion to all this is that it's a desire for more power, not holding power, and that this therefore corrupts the individuals. The researchers did also note, and this could be the biggest problem to their research, that those who behaved in this manner tended to also describe themselves as charming flirts and people with sex appeal. They noted that these individuals had a strong sexual identity, and that this is more likely to be a predictor of how they're going to behave at work than anything else. That is rather important. It seems to be more a case of sexual identity than it is actual desire for power. Not that the two are necessarily unrelated, but that the researchers have not teased out exactly how these things all mesh together, only the end result. Finally, we have for you news about the idea of harvesting parts from bacteria to create synthetic cells. We're particularly fond of this study as it strikes to our heart. The University of Bristol has taken a step forward by being able to reassemble living bacteria out of various bits and pieces that have been taken from other, either dead or very soon to be dead cells. The researchers used two different kinds of bacteria, E. coli and Pseudomonas. The two were put into liquid droplets, and once in the droplet, they were then allowed to float to the surface of it. They were then exposed to a lysosome and a peptide. These allowed the entirety of the bacterial contents to be exposed, basically. They destroyed them, and this created a coating to the fluid that they were in. This allowed for the coating, the droplet, to become an entirely functional cell surface by virtue of it being the entire contents of all these cells just spread out and exposed. They then tested this with two things. One was the creation of ATP and then storage via glycolysis, and the transcription and translation of genes. This completely removed the need for a cell membrane, and instead you had everything laid out on the surface. This could be a pathway into creating various almost modular type structures that could be used in a variety of ways, whether that is manufacturing, biotechnology, medicine, and more. This is, however, of very early days. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.